Welcome back to the pack. I am so glad you've returned to the kingdom for our next journey. Today, we dive into a world of power, secrets, and a fated bond that refuses to be ignored. Before the Alpha King claims his mate, make sure you've claimed your spot in our community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a roar. I love seeing how far our pack reaches across the world, so please comment below and let me know where you're listening from today. And as the tension rises, don't be a stranger. Share your favorite moments or the lines that make your heart race in the comments as you listen. Now, let's step into the palace corridors. In the obsidian halls of the Northern Pack, Cora is a ghost, an Omega hiding her scent and her soul. She only wanted to survive the royal gala, a night of masks and dangerous predators. But fate is a cruel master, and biology is a predator of its own. When she brushes past King Drogo, the man of iron and ice, her first heat ignites with a ferocity that shatters the room. One scent, one heartbeat, and the most powerful alpha in the territories loses his legendary control. As the air thickens with the intoxicating aroma of honeysuckle, the king's voice shatters the silence with a roar of primal possession that changes everything. Everyone out, now. Their souls are locked. Chapter 1. The Scent of Disaster. The Great Northern Palace was a labyrinth of shadows and stone, tonight filled with the cloying scents of hundreds of high-ranking shifters. Cora kept her head bowed, her plain gray gown a stark contrast to the shimmering silks of the elite. She moved like a ghost along the periphery, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. To the powerful alphas dancing under the chandeliers, she was nothing more than a servant. Safety lived in the shadows, and for someone like her, being noticed was the same as being hunted. She just had to survive the final hour of the royal gala before she could slip away and leave this world of teeth and claws behind. As she approached the main corridor, the air grew colder and more pressurized. It was the crushing aura of the Alpha King. Drogo Wolfris stood at the center of a circle of sycophants, his massive frame towering over the crowd. He was a man carved from obsidian, his face a mask of bored indifference. He didn't look like a man capable of warmth, let alone someone who would succumb to the whims of nature. His reputation was built on iron-fisted logic and a ruthless lack of emotion. Cora clutched her skirts and calculated her path. If she moved quickly, she could pass behind him without drawing a single glance. She held her breath, suppressing her own scent with the herbal poultice she had applied. The moment she came within a few feet of him, the world tilted. A violent surge of heat bloomed in her chest, radiating outward until it felt like her blood was boiling. It wasn't just a fever. It was a physical transformation that ripped through her internal defenses. The herbal masking agent she had relied on for years evaporated, replaced by the sweet, intoxicating scent of wild honeysuckle and rain-drenched cedar. Her knees buckled as the primal instinct of her first heat crashed over her, triggered by a proximity she hadn't anticipated. It was the snap, the terrifying biological lock that only occurred when a shifter finally stood in the presence of their fated mate. Drogo froze mid-sentence, his entire body tensing with a sudden lethal energy. The conversation around him died as the air in the corridor seemed to get sucked into his lungs. He turned with a speed that defied his size, his charcoal gray eyes bleeding into a predatory gold. The pupils were slits fixed entirely on the trembling girl in the gray dress. The scent of her hit him like a physical blow, a sweetness so sharp it made his canines ache, and his wolf roar for dominance. For the first time in his reign, the king's composure shattered. The power radiating from him became a physical weight, dropping the lesser wolves to their knees as his instincts overrode every law he had sworn to uphold. He didn't speak to her, and he didn't acknowledge the shocked expressions of the council members or the debutantes standing just inches away. Instead, his chest expanded as he drew in another deep breath of her scent, and then he let out a sound that shook the foundations of the palace. It was a roar of such raw, territorial aggression that it silenced every voice in the ballroom. His command was absolute, backed by the ancient power of his bloodline. "Everyone out! Now!" The force of the command pushed everyone toward the exits in a blind panic. Cora tried to run, her mind screaming in terror, but she only managed 2 steps before a massive hand clamped around her wrist, pinning her to the spot. Chapter 2. The Locked Throne Room. The heavy oak doors groaned as they were slammed shut, leaving Cora alone in the vast, echoing corridor with the man who held the power of life and death over the entire North. The Alpha King's grip on her wrist was like a band of heated iron, his pulse thrumming against her skin with a rhythmic intensity that matched her own racing heart. Silence reclaimed the palace, but it was a violent, vibrating silence, heavy with the scent of wild honeysuckle that continued to pour from Cora's skin. Drogo did not move. He stood like a statue of living muscle, his golden eyes fixed on her face, as if he were trying to memorize every line and curve of her features through the haze of his primal hunger. Cora's breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. The heat within her was no longer a mere fever. It was a living thing, a fire that demanded to be extinguished by the man standing before her. She could feel his wolf, Fenris, prowling just beneath the surface of his skin, a mountain of fur and teeth and ancient instinct. Her own internal defenses had been utterly annihilated. She was an Omega, and her body was screaming for its alpha, regardless of the danger his status represented. The air between them crackled with a psychic energy so potent that it felt like a physical weight against her chest, making it impossible to speak or even think. Drogo leaned in, his nose brushing the sensitive skin of her neck just below her ear. He took a long, shuddering draw of her scent, his chest expanding until his formal tunic looked as though it might burst at the seams. A low, rumbling growl started deep in his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated possession. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was a predator who had found the one piece of his soul that had been missing since birth. His other hand rose, his fingers ghosting over her cheek with a surprising gentleness that terrified her more than his rage ever could. The touch sent sparks through her nervous system, a golden light dancing at the edges of her vision. The king's voice was a rough rasp when he finally spoke, stripped of its usual regal coldness. He muttered that she was his, a fated bond that defied every law of their society. Cora wanted to protest, to tell him that she was a nobody who wanted only to be free, but the words died in her throat as he pulled her closer, his heat seeping into her very bones. He seemed to be fighting himself, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone wall behind her. He knew what this meant, the scandal, the political ruin, the breaking of oaths. Yet, as he looked into her eyes, it was clear that the world could burn as long as he held her in the ashes. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, a heavy thud echoed from the other side of the doors. The High Council was not going to wait forever, and the sounds of shouting guards began to bleed through the wood. Drogo snarled at the interruption, his eyes flashing a deeper gold, but he didn't let go of her. Instead, he leaned down until his lips were inches from hers, whispering that no one would take her from him, not the council, and not the laws of men. But as the doors began to rattle under the force of those outside, Cora felt a sharp, stinging pain at the base of her skull, a warning of the darkness that followed such a monumental claim. Chapter 3. Morning After the Storm. The first light of dawn bled through the high arched windows of the king's private solar, casting long, pale shadows across the floor. Cora sat on the edge of an oversized velvet chair, her hands trembling in her lap. The fever of the previous night had settled into a low, persistent hum, a constant reminder of the bond that now tethered her soul to the Alpha King. She was no longer in her gray servant's dress. A silk robe had been provided, but the luxury felt like a gilded cage. Beyond the heavy doors, she could hear the muffled sounds of a palace in chaos. The rumors would be spreading like wildfire through the northern pack, The king had cleared the ballroom for an omega. Drogo stood by the window, his back to her. He had shed his ceremonial armor for a simple black shirt that strained against his broad shoulders. He hadn't slept. The restlessness of his wolf was visible in the way his muscles twitched. Every time he turned to look at her, Cora felt that same magnetic pull, a primal need to go to him and bury her face in his chest. But fear held her back. She was a girl who had spent her life trying to be invisible, and now she was the center of a storm that could tear the kingdom apart. The silence between them was thick with things unsaid, a bridge that neither was ready to cross. The doors to the solar swung open without a knock, and a tall, elderly man with silver hair and a face lined with deep furrows stepped inside. This was Elder Harkon, the head of the High Council. He didn't look at Cora. His eyes were fixed on Drogo with an expression of profound disappointment. He spoke of the outrage in the court and the demands for an explanation. The king had abandoned his guests and his betrothed for a girl of no standing. Harkon's voice was like grinding stones, reminding the king that the stability of the North rested on his upcoming marriage. To claim a mate now was not just a personal choice, it was an act of political suicide. Drogo didn't flinch. He turned slowly, his gaze so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He stated clearly that he did not owe the council an explanation for the workings of his own blood. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying growl that warned Harkon he was pushing his luck. The king declared that Cora was under his personal protection, and that any slight against her would be treated as a direct challenge to the crown. It was a bold, dangerous move that only heightened the tension. Cora felt a swell of gratitude, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization of what she had become. A liability. Harkon leaned in, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He reminded Drogo that the Shadowclaw pack was already moving on the southern borders, and that the alliance with Lady Octavia's father was the only thing keeping the northern pack from being slaughtered. He warned that if the king chose his heart over his duty, he would be the one to hand the crown to their enemies. As the elder turned to leave, he cast one final, piercing look at Cora, one filled with a calculating malice that made her blood run cold. She realized then that she wasn't just a prisoner of the king's desire, she was a target for everyone who wanted him to fail. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Crown. The heavy atmosphere in the solar didn't lift after Harkon's departure. If anything, the weight of the king's responsibilities seemed to settle more heavily on Cora's shoulders. Drogo walked over to a table and poured a glass of dark amber liquid, his movements precise but tense. He didn't offer her any. Instead, he stood a few feet away, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He began to speak of the Blood Oath, an ancient and magical contract signed in the blood of his ancestors. It was a tether that bound the Wulfrus bloodline to the defense of the land, and it was currently demanding a sacrifice he wasn't sure he could make. He explained that years ago, to end a devastating border war, his father had made a pact with the general of the Western Reaches. Drogo was to marry the general's daughter, Octavia, on the summer solstice. The oath was woven into the very fabric of his magic. To break it would mean a slow, agonizing death for the king and the potential collapse of the pack's spiritual defenses. The Shadowclaw pack was waiting for exactly that kind of weakness. They were a brutal, nomadic group that thrived on the Blight, a magical sickness that turned fertile lands into dust and shifters into mindless monsters. Without the alliance, the North would fall to the shadow within weeks. Cora listened, her heart sinking further with every word. She was the unfit mate, the unexpected variable that threatened to destroy a carefully constructed peace. She asked him why he didn't just let her go, why he didn't let the heat pass and pretend the snap had never happened. The question seemed to offend him. Drogo stepped closer, the scent of expensive leather and lightning-charged air surrounding her. He told her that a fated bond wasn't a choice one could simply ignore. His wolf would never accept another. and to live apart from his mate would eventually drive him into a feral madness that would be just as destructive as the blight. The tragedy of their situation was a physical ache in Cora's chest. She saw the man behind the mask of the king, a man who was being crushed by the dual pressures of destiny and duty. He reached out, his hand hovering near her hair before he pulled it back, as if he feared his own touch might break her. He told her that he had 7 days. 7 days to find a way to break an unbreakable oath, or to watch his kingdom crumble. He promised her that he would fight for them, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt that he couldn't quite hide. He was a king who could command thousands, but he was powerless against the magic of his own blood. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of horns blowing at the palace gates. It was a sharp, triumphant sound that signaled the arrival of a high-ranking guest. Drogo's expression hardened, his jaw setting in a grim line. He looked out toward the courtyard where a massive carriage draped in silver and blue was pulling to a stop. It was the general's colors. Lady Octavia had arrived 3 days early, no doubt spurred by the rumors of the king's scandalous behavior at the gala. The clock was now ticking faster than either of them had anticipated, and the woman who expected to be queen was not known for her mercy toward those who stood in her way. Chapter 5. Arrival of the Rival. The doors to the royal receiving hall were thrown open with a flourish that spoke of immense pride and even greater ambition. Lady Octavia swept into the room, her presence as sharp and cold as a winter frost. She was stunning, with hair the color of spun moonlight, and eyes that held the calculating glint of a seasoned predator. She didn't look like a woman who had just traveled for days. She looked like a queen coming to claim her throne. Behind her marched a contingent of elite guards, their silver-plated armor reflecting the morning sun. Her gaze immediately bypassed the king and landed squarely on Cora, who was standing awkwardly by the throne. The silence in the hall was suffocating as Octavia approached. She didn't bow. Instead, she stopped a few feet from Drogo and offered a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke of the concerning rumors she had heard on the road and how she had hurried to her future husband's side to help him manage whatever temporary distractions had arisen in her absence. Her voice was like silk over a blade, perfectly polite while dripping with condescension. She treated Cora as if she were a piece of furniture, a minor inconvenience that would soon be discarded. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly, making Cora feel smaller than she ever had in the servants' quarters. Drogo stepped forward, his presence a dark, looming shadow that buffered the space between the two women. His voice was a low warning as he greeted Octavia, acknowledging her arrival but offering no apologies. He made it clear that Cora was his guest and was to be treated with the respect due to someone under his protection. Octavia's smile didn't waver, but her eyes darkened with a flash of genuine fury. She wasn't used to being defied, especially not by the man she considered her property. She remarked on the king's sudden interest in charity, her tone suggesting that Cora was a stray dog he had picked up from the gutter. The tension escalated when Octavia insisted on a private tour of the palace gardens to discuss the wedding preparations. She pointedly ignored the fact that Drogo's hand was resting protectively on the hilt of his sword, a gesture he only made when his wolf was close to the surface. She began to talk about the grand ceremony and the thousands of guests who were expecting a spectacle. Every word was a reminder of the blood oath and the catastrophic consequences of breaking it. Cora watched them, feeling like an interloper in a play she hadn't auditioned for. She saw the way the court watched Octavia with awe, and how they looked at her with pity or disgust. As Octavia turned to lead the way out, she paused beside Cora, leaning in close enough for only the Omega to hear her. She whispered that a moth should never try to dance with the sun unless it wanted to be incinerated. Before Cora could respond, a sudden, searing wave of heat rushed through her body. The second wave of her heat, more intense than the first. She gasped, clutching her stomach as the silver crescent mark on the back of her neck began to glow with a faint, ethereal light through the thin fabric of her collar. Octavia's eyes widened as she caught the shimmer of the mark, her expression shifting from arrogance to a mask of pure, lethal shock. Chapter 6. Fever and Shadows. Cora retreated to the sanctuary of her chambers, the walls seemingly closing in as the biological fire intensified. The second wave of her heat was not merely a physical yearning, but a sensory overload that blurred the edges of reality. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, twisting like ink in water. She collapsed onto the bed, her breath hitching as a strange, cooling sensation began to fight against the inferno in her veins. When she looked down at her hands, she gasped in disbelief. A pale, pearlescent glow was emanating from her palms, pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. It wasn't the golden light of an alpha or the dull gray of an omega. It was something ancient and lunar. As the light grew brighter, the room around her dissolved into a waking nightmare. She was no longer in the palace but standing in the middle of a vast, skeletal forest. The trees were blackened husks, their branches reaching up like the fingers of a drowning man. This was the blight in its truest form, a rot that didn't just kill the body, but consumed the very soul of the earth. She could feel the agony of the soil beneath her bare feet, a silent scream of a land that had been drained of its vitality. In the center of this desolation stood a figure made of pure shadow, its eyes two voids of nothingness that seemed to stare directly into her essence. The creature reached out, and as its fingers brushed the air, the darkness spread like a plague, devouring everything in its path. The vision shifted, showing her the palace gardens she had seen only hours before. The vibrant greenery was being choked by the same oily darkness, the roots of the ancient oaks turning to ash. She saw Drogo standing on the battlements, his face etched with a despair he would never show his people. He was fighting a losing battle against an enemy that couldn't be killed with swords or claws. Cora tried to cry out to him, to tell him she could see the source of the rot, but her voice was a mere whisper in the wind. The shadow creature turned its gaze toward the palace, a low, echoing hiss filling her mind, warning her that the light she carried was a beacon it intended to extinguish before the moon reached its zenith. The vision shattered as the door to her chamber creaked open, throwing her back into the physical world. She was drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The glow in her palms faded into a dull shimmer, leaving her hands feeling cold and empty. She scrambled to sit up, pulling the silk sheets around her as if they could provide protection against the horrors she had just witnessed. It was no longer just about a mate bond or a royal scandal. The fate of the entire North was tied to the sickness she had seen, and for some reason, her body was reacting to the rot as much as it was reacting to the king. She realized with a terrifying clarity that the snap hadn't just been a romantic destiny, it was a cosmic alignment. The heat wasn't just preparing her for a mate, it was awakening a dormant power that had been hidden in her bloodline for generations. But as she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway, she realized she had no idea how to control the light, or how to explain the shadows that were currently creeping toward the palace gates. The danger was no longer outside the walls, it was within her, growing alongside the bond she shared with the Alpha King. Chapter 7. The Mark of the Sentinel. The following morning, the weight of the vision hung over Cora like a heavy shroud. She sought the only solace she could find, the large marble bath in the corner of her dressing room. The warm water, scented with oils of lavender and mint, helped to dull the persistent ache of her heat, but it could not quiet her mind. As she scrubbed her skin, she felt a strange, raised texture at the nape of her neck. It wasn't a blemish or a scar she remembered having. With trembling fingers, she reached for a hand mirror, positioning herself between the vanity and the wall so she could see her reflection. What she saw made her breath hitch in her throat, the mirror nearly slipping from her damp grasp. Etched into the pale skin at the very top of her spine was a delicate silver crescent moon. It wasn't a tattoo, it was a mark that seemed to sit beneath the skin, glowing with a soft, ethereal radiance that matched the light she had seen in her palms. She traced the lines of the crescent, feeling a hum of energy vibrate through her fingertips. Memories of her mother's whispered bedtime stories flooded back. Tales of the lunar sentinels, the protectors of the earth who could talk to the forest and heal the deepest wounds of the world. They were thought to be a myth, a bloodline that had died out during the Great Cleansing centuries ago. But the mark was unmistakable, a signature of a lineage that surpassed the rank of any Alpha or Omega. The realization was staggering. If she were a sentinel, she wasn't just a low-ranking wolf who had gotten lucky with a mate bond. She was the missing piece of a prophecy she barely understood. The Sentinels were the only ones who could push back the blight, their magic acting as a direct counter to the shadow that was currently devouring the North. But history also told of how they were hunted by those who feared their power or sought to harness it for their own dark ends. To be a sentinel was to be a beacon for both hope and destruction. She understood now why she had been so desperate to remain invisible. Her instincts had been trying to protect the secret hidden in her DNA. She quickly covered the mark with her hair, her mind racing. If Drogo found out, would he see her as his mate or as a weapon to be used for the survival of his pack? And what of Octavia? The woman was clearly ambitious, and the knowledge of Cora's true nature would make her an even greater threat. Cora felt a sudden, crushing loneliness. She was caught between a king who owned her heart and a destiny that demanded she save a world that had always treated her like trash. She needed answers, but the palace library was a fortress of its own, guarded by scholars who would report her every move to the High Council. As she finished dressing in a high-collared gown to hide the silver crescent, she felt the bond with Drogo pulse with a sudden, sharp intensity. It wasn't a physical sensation this time, but an emotional one, a wave of bone-deep exhaustion and frustration bleeding over from his mind into hers. He was nearby, and he was suffering. The connection was becoming two-way, a bridge of consciousness that ignored the walls of the palace and the rules of their society. She couldn't stay hidden in her room forever, while the man she was fated to carried the weight of the world alone. With a deep breath, she stepped out into the hallway, determined to find the truth, before the shadows claimed them both. Chapter 8. A King's Desperation. The library of the Obsidian Palace was a cavernous space filled with the scent of old parchment and beeswax. It was the one place where Cora felt she could breathe, the silence providing a temporary barrier against the chaos of the court. She moved through the aisles, her fingers brushing the spines of leather-bound volumes, looking for any mention of the Sentinels. She was so engrossed in her search that she didn't hear the heavy thud of boots on the stone floor until it was too late. A shadow fell over the table where she had spread out several dusty scrolls, and the familiar scent of leather and mountain air told her exactly who had found her. Drogo stood behind her, his presence overwhelming the small space between the bookshelves. He didn't say a word, but the intensity of his gaze was a physical pressure against her back. When she turned to face him, she saw the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his jaw. Without a word, he reached out and pulled her to her feet, his hands gripping her waist with a desperation that startled her. The heat between them flared instantly, a white-hot spark that made her gasp. He pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he drew in the scent of her honeysuckle. He confessed that he couldn't think, couldn't lead, and couldn't breathe when she wasn't in his sight. The vulnerability in his voice shattered the last of her defenses. She reached up, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs tracing the rough stubble on his jaw. In that moment, the crown didn't matter, the blood oath didn't matter, and the looming threat of the Shadowclaw pack was a distant memory. There was only the man and the woman, bound by a force older than the mountains themselves. Drogo leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers in a silent plea for a connection that went beyond biology. He whispered her name like a prayer, a sound of pure devotion that made her heart swell with an agonizing love. Just as his lips pressed against hers, the heavy doors of the library were thrown open. A frantic guard burst into the room, his armor clattering as he skidded to a halt. He ignored the intimate position of the king and the Omega, his face pale with terror. He managed to stammer out that the blight had breached the inner sanctum of the royal gardens. It wasn't just a slow rot anymore. It was an aggressive surge of darkness that was withering the ancient silverwood trees in real time. The news hit Drogo like a physical blow, his wolf instantly surging to the surface, his eyes flashing that dangerous predatory gold. He let go of Cora, the sudden loss of his warmth leaving her shivering in the cold air of the library. He didn't look back as he barked orders at the guard, his voice returning to the cold, commanding tone of the Alpha King. He had to go. The defense of the palace was his primary duty, and the gardens were the spiritual heart of the pack. Cora watched him go, her heart heavy with the secret she was still carrying. She looked down at the scrolls she had been reading, her gaze landing on a passage that described how a sentinel's touch could act as a conduit for the Earth's life force. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant exposing herself to the very people who might destroy her. Chapter 9. The First Healing. The royal gardens were a scene of devastation that mirrored Cora's vision. The once lush greenery was turning a sickly, oily black, the leaves curling into ash as the darkness moved across the grass like an incoming tide. Guards stood at the perimeter, their swords drawn but useless against an enemy made of shadow. Drogo was at the center of the chaos, his hands glowing with a faint golden light as he tried to use his alpha energy to push back the rot. But it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand. The blight fed on aggression and power, growing stronger the more he fought it. Cora slipped through the shadows of the stone walkway, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel the agony of the plants, a psychic resonance that made her own skin itch with discomfort. She moved toward an ancient oak tree at the edge of the clearing, the same one she had seen in her vision. It was the anchor of the garden, and if it fell, the rest of the palace would follow. She ignored the shouts of the guards who noticed her presence, focusing entirely on the dying tree. As she reached out her hand, the silver crescent on her neck began to pulse with a blinding light, the heat in her blood transforming into a cool, revitalizing stream of energy. The moment her palm touched the blackened bark, a shockwave of silver light erupted from her skin. The darkness that had been clinging to the tree hissed as if it were being burned by holy fire, recoiling in a frantic scramble to escape the light. Cora closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of her will and her love for the land into the connection. She felt a sudden, massive surge of strength, but it didn't come from her alone. Through the bond, she felt Drogo's power flowing into her, providing the raw fuel her sentinel magic needed to manifest. They were a circuit, a perfect union of alpha strength and sentinel grace. The effect was instantaneous. The blackened branches of the oak tree began to pulse with a vibrant green light, the rot falling away like old skin. New buds erupted from the wood, blooming into full leaves in a matter of seconds. The silver light spread outward from the base of the tree, racing across the grass and purging the blight wherever it touched. The guards fell back in awe, their weapons lowered as the air in the garden was cleansed of the oily stench of decay. Drogo stood frozen, his eyes wide as he watched the girl he thought was a helpless Omega perform a miracle that even the high priests couldn't manage. As the last of the darkness was pushed back beyond the garden walls, Cora slumped against the trunk of the tree, her energy completely spent. The silver light faded, leaving her feeling hollow and dizzy. She looked up to see Drogo walking toward her, his expression a mixture of profound relief and terrifying curiosity. He reached out to help her up, his touch now vibrating with the shared energy of their combined feet. She had saved the garden, but in doing so, she had revealed her secret to everyone present. The invisible Omega was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous and much more essential to the survival of the North. Chapter 10. The Council's Suspicion. The news of the miraculous healing spread through the palace faster than the blight ever could. By the time Cora was escorted back to the royal wing, the atmosphere of the court had shifted from one of suspicion to one of fearful reverence. However, not everyone viewed her display of power as a blessing. In the darkened chambers of the High Temple, the High Priestess Marana stood before a pool of scrying water, her face a mask of cold calculation. She had felt the surge of lunar energy from the gardens, a frequency that hadn't been felt in the north for over 300 years. To her, Cora was not a savior. She was a disruption to the divine order. Marana summoned Lady Octavia to the temple, the two women meeting in the flickering light of the blue flame torches. The High Priestess spoke of the ancient texts and the danger of the Sentinel bloodline. She warned Octavia that if the king chose to mate with a Sentinel, the traditional power structures of the pack would be rendered obsolete. The blood oath, while powerful, was a creation of men. The fated bond of a Sentinel and an Alpha was a creation of the moon itself. If the bond were allowed to be fully sealed, Drogo would have the power to defy the council, the general, and even the priestesses. Octavia's face hardened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Octavia wasn't interested in the theology of the situation, only the practical threat to her crown. She had seen the way Drogo looked at the girl, not just with lust, but with a burgeoning respect that was far more dangerous to her plans. She realized that Cora was the glitch that could erase her future in a single heartbeat. The priestess suggested that the Sentinel's power was tied to her purity and her connection to the moon. If that connection could be severed or corrupted, the power would vanish, leaving Cora as nothing more than an Omega once again. They began to whisper of old rituals and silver-lined traps designed to suppress the lunar fire. While the conspiracy took root in the shadows, Drogo was facing his own battle in the council chambers. The elders were in an uproar, demanding to know what kind of creature he had brought into their midst. They argued that Cora's power was unnatural, a trick of the Shadowclaw pack to gain entrance to their sanctuary. Drogo roared for silence, his voice shaking the very stones of the hall. He declared that Cora had done what none of them could. She had pushed back the blight and saved the Silverwood. He refused to hear any more talk of her being a threat, his territorial instincts flaring with enough heat to make the air in the room shimmer. Despite his outward show of strength, Drogo was deeply troubled. He knew that by revealing her power, Cora had painted a massive target on her back. He returned to her chambers late that evening, finding her standing on the balcony looking out at the stars. He didn't approach her with his usual dominance. Instead, he stood at a distance, the silence between them heavy with the weight of her new identity. He asked her if she had known what she was. Cora turned to him, the silver crescent on her neck catching the moonlight, and admitted that she was only just beginning to understand. But as they stood there, a cold wind blew through the balcony, carrying with it the scent of betrayal. Chapter 11. The Moonlight Run. The walls of the Obsidian Palace felt like they were vibrating with the mounting tension of 1,000 unspoken threats. Drogo could feel the restlessness of his wolf, Fenris, clawing at the back of his mind, demanding a release that the cold stone corridors could not provide. He looked at Cora, whose face was pale and drawn from the weight of her newly revealed identity. Without a word, he took her hand and led her through a secret passage that opened onto the rugged cliffs overlooking the Silverwood forest. The air out here was crisp and untainted, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. He stripped away his heavy tunic, his body rippling with the impending transformation. He didn't ask if she was ready. He simply shifted, his bones cracking and reforming until a massive charcoal gray wolf stood where the king had been. Cora hesitated for only a second before she followed suit. She had always been a small wolf, her fur the color of cream and starlight, but tonight, the transformation felt different. As her paws hit the earth, a surge of silver energy rushed through her limbs, making her feel faster and stronger than she had ever been in her life. Drogo let out a low, inviting huff and took off into the trees, a dark blur against the shadows. Cora raced after him, her heart soaring as the wind whipped through her fur. For the first time, they weren't a king and a servant, or an alpha and an omega. They were two predators running in perfect synchronization, their scents mingling in a trail of honeysuckle and mountain air that marked the forest as theirs. They ran for miles, leaping over fallen logs and splashing through shallow streams. The connection between them was no longer a source of fear, it was a lifeline. Through the bond, Cora could feel Drogo's fierce joy, a raw emotion that he suppressed every waking moment in the palace. He pushed her to her limits, testing her speed, and she met his challenge with a playful nip at his heels. In the wild, the political alliances and the dying land felt like a distant nightmare. Here, under the watchful gaze of the full moon, there was only the rhythm of their breathing and the thrum of the earth beneath their paws. It was a dance of souls that solidified the fated bond more deeply than any ceremony could. When they finally slowed to a halt at a high ridge overlooking the valley, the world seemed to hold its breath. Drogo walked over to her, his massive head resting against her shoulder as he let out a long, contented sigh. Cora leaned into his warmth, her small frame dwarfed by his power. In this form, the truth was undeniable. He could not marry Octavia. He could not bind himself to a woman who would never understand the wildness of his heart or the depth of his connection to Cora. The realization hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. Drogo looked out at the horizon, his golden eyes filled with a new, dangerous resolve. He would break the world before he let her go. The moment of peace was shattered by a low, discordant howl echoing from the direction of the palace. It wasn't the sound of a northern wolf. It was the jagged, broken cry of a shadow creature. Drogo's ears flattened against his head, and a vicious snarl ripped through his chest. The sanctuary of the forest was being breached, and the reality of their situation rushed back with the force of an avalanche. They turned and began the long sprint back toward the fortress. But as they ran, Cora felt a cold shiver of dread. The forest felt different now, as if the trees themselves were warning them that the greatest threat wasn't the shadows outside, but the poison already festering within the palace walls. Chapter 12. The Traitor's Price. The transition back into human form was jarring, leaving Cora feeling exposed and vulnerable as she slipped back into the palace through the servants' entrance. She needed to know what the Shadowclaw Pack was planning, and the royal archives were no longer enough. She moved through the kitchens and the laundry rooms, using her old skills as an invisible Omega to gather the whispers of the staff. But it wasn't the servants who held the key. As she passed the general's private study, she heard the low, gravelly voice of Lady Octavia's father. She pressed herself against the cold stone of the alcove, her breath hitching as she realized he wasn't alone. He was speaking to a figure cloaked in tattered black rags, a creature that radiated the oily scent of the blight. The general was laughing, a sound devoid of any warmth. He spoke of the accidental breach in the gardens and how the king's desperation was playing right into their hands. He was the one providing the catalysts for the shadow creatures to bypass the palace's ancient wards. His plan was simple and horrific. Use the blight to weaken the pack's morale until the people begged for the alliance with the Western Reaches. Once the wedding was finalized and the blood oath sealed, he would use Octavia to control Drogo, effectively turning the Northern Pack into a puppet state. He didn't care about the lives lost to the shadows. To him, they were merely fuel for his ambition to rule the Seven Territories. Cora's blood turned to ice as she listened to the traitorous details. The Shadowclaw Pack wasn't just an invading force. They were the general's insurance policy. He was trading the health of the land for a crown he would wear through his daughter. The cloaked figure hissed a warning about the girl with the light, and the general's voice turned murderous. He promised that Cora would be dealt with before the sun rose on the wedding day. He viewed her not as a sentinel, but as a minor obstacle that could be crushed with enough silver and shadows. Cora backed away slowly, her mind spinning. She had to tell Drogo, but who would believe an Omega over a decorated general? She hurried toward the king's quarters, but the hallways felt longer and more twisted than usual. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, whispering the general's threats. She realized that the corruption had spread further than she thought. Even some of the palace guards were wearing the general's colors beneath their surcoats. The entire infrastructure of the palace was a web of deceit designed to trap the king and stifle the light of the sentinel. If she went to the council, she would likely be handing herself over to the very men who wanted her dead. She was alone in a fortress of enemies, with the only man she could trust currently surrounded by advisors who were poisoned by the general's lies. Just as she reached the heavy oak doors of the royal wing, she was intercepted by Lady Octavia. The noblewoman stood in the center of the hall, her arms crossed and a smug expression on her beautiful, cruel face. She didn't say anything at first, merely watching Cora with a look of intense satisfaction. The air around her felt heavy and stagnant, as if the darkness her father was courting was already beginning to cling to her. She stepped forward, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards. She asked Cora if she had enjoyed her little run in the woods, her tone suggesting that she knew exactly where the king had been. The trap was closing, and Cora realized with a jolt of terror that the general wasn't the only traitor in the family. Chapter 13. The Forbidden Kiss. The confrontation with Octavia left Cora shaken, but she managed to push past the woman and find Drogo in his private balcony. The king was staring out at the darkened forest, his hands gripping the stone railing so hard the rock was beginning to crack. When he turned to her, the sheer exhaustion in his eyes almost broke her heart. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told him everything she had overheard in the general's study. She spoke of the betrayal, the alliance with the shadow creatures, and the plan to turn the North into a puppet state. Drogo listened in silence, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, lethal rage that made the air in the room hum with power. For a moment, the king said nothing. Then he moved across the room with the grace of a stalking panther, closing the distance between them until Cora was backed against the stone wall. He didn't speak of the general or the war. Instead, he looked at her with a raw, unshielded longing that stripped away his royal mask. He told her that he had spent his entire life doing what was expected, following the laws of his ancestors and the demands of the council. But as he looked at her, he realized that he could no longer live a lie. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, and leaned in. When his lips finally met hers, the world around them seemed to explode in a symphony of silver and gold light. The kiss was everything Cora had feared and craved. It was a collision of souls, a desperate claim that ignored the dangers of the world outside the room. The snap finally settled into a permanent humming vibration in her chest. For a few seconds, there was only the taste of him and the warmth of his body against hers. But the moment of bliss was cruelly short-lived. A sudden, violent spasm racked Drogo's frame, and he let out a strangled cry of agony as he collapsed to his knees. His skin began to smoke where the air touched it, and jagged black lines began to crawl up his neck, tracing the path of his veins like a spreading poison. It was the blood oath. By acknowledging his love for Cora and betraying the intent of his betrothal, the magical contract was attacking his very life force. The oath didn't care about fated mates or true love. It only recognized the breach of a sworn blood contract. Cora dropped to the floor beside him, her hands glowing with silver light as she tried to pull the darkness from his skin. But the magic of the oath was different from the blight. It was a self-inflicted curse tied to his royal blood. Every time he tried to reach for her, the pain intensified, his wolf howling in agony within his mind. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in as the magic fought to separate them. Drogo looked up at her, his face pale and etched with suffering. He told her to run, to save herself before the council found them. He knew that if he were found in this state with her, the general would use it as proof that Cora was a witch who had cursed the king. But Cora refused to leave him. She pressed her forehead against his, her silver light clashing with the black lines of the oath. The conflict of magics created a high-pitched ring in the air, a sound of breaking glass that echoed through the royal wing. They were caught in a deadly stalemate, a king who would rather die than give up his mate, and an oath that was determined to kill him for the attempt. Chapter 14. Octavia's Trap. The sound of the magical clash had not gone unnoticed. Before Cora could stabilize Drogo's condition, the doors to the solar were kicked open. Lady Octavia marched in, flanked by 4 of the general's personal guards. She didn't look shocked by the sight of the king on the floor. She looked triumphant. She held a silver scepter in her hand, the tip glowing with a dull, sickly purple light. She sneered at Cora, calling her a parasite that was draining the king of his life. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she commanded the guards to seize the Omega. Cora tried to fight back, her silver light sparking in her palms, but the scepter in Octavia's hand acted as a dampener, snuffing out her magic before it could manifest. The guards were brutal, pinning Cora's arms behind her back with silver-lined shackles that burned her skin. She cried out as the metal bit into her wrists, the silver acting as a poison to her shifter side. Drogo tried to stand, his eyes flashing gold as he let out a weak, guttural roar, but the blood oath chose that moment to surge again, pinning him to the ground with a fresh wave of agony. Octavia walked over to him, her expression one of mock pity. She leaned down and whispered that she was doing this for his own good, to save him from the ruinous path he had chosen. She promised that once the infection was removed, he would see reason and fulfill his duty to her family. Octavia turned her attention back to Cora, her gaze landing on the silver crescent mark that was now visible as Cora's collar was torn in the struggle. A look of pure, unadulterated greed crossed the noblewoman's face. She reached out and traced the mark with a cold fingernail, remarking on the waste of such power on a creature of no birth. She revealed her true intent. She didn't just want the crown, she wanted the Sentinel's power for herself. Her father had found an ancient ritual that allowed for the transfer of lunar energy through a blood sacrifice. Octavia intended to use Cora as a living battery to fuel her own ascension, turning herself into a goddess queen who would never need a king's permission. As the guards dragged Cora toward the secret staircase that led to the dungeons, she looked back at Drogo. He was reaching for her, his fingers clawing at the stone floor, his voice a broken whisper of her name. The sight of his helplessness was more painful than the silver shackles. She was being taken to the one place in the palace where no one would hear her screams, a place where the general's men held absolute authority. Octavia followed close behind, her laughter echoing through the hallway like the sharpening of a blade. The sun was beginning to set, and Cora knew that if she didn't find a way to break free before midnight, she wouldn't live to see the dawn. The descent into the lower levels of the palace was a journey into darkness. The air grew damp and heavy with the scent of mildew and ancient despair. These were the dungeons of echoes, built centuries ago to hold the most dangerous enemies of the pack. The walls were lined with silver, designed to suppress the shifting ability and the magic of any prisoner kept within. As the heavy iron door of the lowest cell slammed shut behind her, Cora was plunged into total shadow. She could hear the sound of Octavia's departing footsteps, leaving her alone with nothing but the burning pain of the silver and the knowledge that the man she loved was dying just a few floors above her. Chapter 15. The Dungeon of Echoes. The darkness in the dungeon was absolute, a heavy velvet weight that seemed to press into Cora's very lungs. The silver shackles on her wrists felt like they were melting into her skin, sending rhythmic jolts of pain through her nervous system that made it impossible to concentrate. She slumped against the cold, damp wall, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Every sound in the dungeon was amplified: the drip of water from a cracked pipe, the scuttling of rats in the corners, and the distant, muffled echoes of the palace above. These were the echoes for which the prison was named, the psychic remnants of every wolf who had ever been broken within these walls. As the hours ticked by, the echoes began to whisper to her. They spoke of failure, of the inevitability of the shadows, and of the foolishness of an Omega who thought she could change the fate of a kingdom. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, trying to summon the silver light of the sentinel, but it felt like a flickering candle in a hurricane. The silver-lined walls were doing their job, creating a vacuum that sucked the magic right out of her blood. She felt smaller and more insignificant than ever before, a ghost returning to the shadows where she had spent most of her life. The despair was a physical entity, coiling around her heart like a cold serpent. Above her, in the royal solar, Drogo was descending into a different kind of darkness. Without Cora's presence to balance the bond, his wolf was finally breaking free of its restraints. The pain of the blood oath was being drowned out by a raw, feral grief that was stripping away his humanity. He paced the room on all fours, his claws gouging deep furrows into the floorboards, a continuous, low growl vibrating in his chest. His advisors and guards stood outside the doors, terrified to enter as the sound of furniture being shattered echoed through the hall. The king was gone. There was only Fenris, a monster of charcoal fur and golden eyes who wanted nothing but to tear the world apart to find his mate. Fenris's rage was a psychic storm that Cora could feel even through the silver walls. The bond was screaming, a high-pitched frequency of agony and loss that made her own wolf howl in sympathy. She realized that if she didn't get out, Drogo would truly go feral. And the first thing he would do was kill the general and Octavia, triggering a civil war that would destroy the North. She had to be the anchor. She had to find a way to bridge the gap between her light and his darkness. She began to hum a low, ancient melody her mother had taught her, a song of the earth and the moon that was designed to steady the heart of a sentinel in times of war. The melody seemed to provide a small pocket of peace in the middle of the psychic chaos. The silver shackles still burned, but the light in her chest began to pulse with a renewed rhythm. She realized that the silver didn't just suppress magic, it reflected it. If she could build up enough energy and release it all at once, the silver walls would act as an amplifier rather than a dampener. It was a dangerous gamble that could just as easily kill her as free her. She began to draw in the energy from the earth beneath the floor, ignoring the pain as the silver resisted her. She was no longer just an Omega. She was a sentinel, and her king was waiting for her in the storm. Chapter 16. The King's Rampage. The royal wing of the Obsidian Palace had become a graveyard of shattered marble and shredded tapestries. Drogo was no longer a man pretending to be a monarch. He was a force of nature driven by a singular, agonizing void where his mate's soul should have been. Fenris, the charcoal gray wolf, had fully submerged the king's human consciousness, leaving only a predatory instinct that saw every closed door as a barrier to his Cora. He moved with a lethality that terrified even the most seasoned royal guards, his claws leaving jagged scars across the ancient stone walls. The council members huddled in the high gallery, watching in frozen horror as their sovereign tore through the throne room. They had wanted a strong leader, but they had forgotten that a wolf's strength was anchored by his mate. Without her, he was merely a monster with a crown. The High Priestess Morana tried to intervene, her voice chanting ancient suppressive verses that usually brought even the most unruly alphas to their knees. But the magic of the fated bond was older and more primal than any ritual she possessed. Drogo turned his golden gaze toward her, and the sheer pressure of his aura forced her to stumble backward, her chanting dying in her throat. He let out a roar that did not sound human, a sound that vibrated through the marrow of everyone within the palace walls. It was a promise of total annihilation. He didn't care about the Shadowclaw Pack or the dying lands. If Cora was not returned to him, he would systematically dismantle the very foundations of the Northern Pack until nothing remained but dust. The general stood at the back of the hall, his hand resting on his sword, his face pale but determined. He realized too late that he had underestimated the power of the snap. He had thought he could control a grieving king, but he was facing a feral alpha who could sense the general's scent of betrayal lingering in the air. Drogo lunged toward him, a blur of fur and muscle that knocked several guards aside like straw dolls. The king's wolf pinned the general against a pillar, his hot breath smelling of copper and lightning. Fenris didn't kill him instantly. He wanted the traitor to feel the weight of a king's wrath. The palace trembled as the Alpha's command echoed through every corridor, demanding his mate or promising a funeral pyre for the entire kingdom. As the chaos reached its peak, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew cold, and the flickering torchlight turned a pale, ghostly silver. Drogo paused, his ears twitching as he caught a familiar scent. Sweet honeysuckle and rain-drenched cedar, wafting from the vents leading to the lower levels. The roar he let out this time was different. It was a call, a desperate search for an answer from the depths of the earth. He ignored the general and the council, turning his focus toward the floor. He began to dig into the stone with a frantic, bone-breaking strength, his instincts telling him that his light was buried beneath the very mountain they called home. The king's rampage had found its direction, and heaven help anyone who stood between a wolf and his trapped mate. Chapter 17. The Sentinel Awakes. Deep within the Dungeon of Echoes, Cora was no longer the trembling Omega who had walked into the palace gala. The silver shackles were still biting into her wrists, but the pain had become a secondary sensation, eclipsed by the roaring power of the earth calling out to its protector. She could feel the silver's resistance, the way the metal tried to drain her spirit, but she had discovered a secret within the pain. The silver didn't just dampen her magic, it held it captive, creating a pressure cooker of lunar energy that was reaching its breaking point. She stopped fighting the shackles and began to feed them, pouring every ounce of her fear, her love for Drogo, and her ancient heritage into the metal. The silver began to glow with a violet-white intensity that lit the dark cell like a miniature star. The whispers of the dungeon's past residents grew silent as the sentinel's light expanded. Cora felt her consciousness stretching through the stone, connecting with the roots of the silverwood far above. She realized that she was not just a girl. She was a conduit for the life force of the entire North. The lunar fire in her veins began to hum a melody of restoration and destruction. With a scream that was echoed by the moon itself, she released the built-up energy. The silver shackles didn't just break. They vaporized into a fine mist of stardust. The explosion of power rippled outward, the silver-lined walls of the cell shattering into millions of shards, as the lunar fire tore through the damp, dark prison. The Dungeon of Echoes was silenced forever by the roar of the Sentinel's awakening. She stepped out of the ruins of her cell, her gown tattered and her skin glowing with a soft, ethereal radiance. She didn't feel weak. She felt resurrected. The silver mark on her neck was no longer a secret to be hidden. It was a beacon that pulsed with a rhythmic light, guiding her through the maze of the lower levels. Any guard who tried to block her path was swept aside by a wave of pure kinetic energy. She wasn't killing them, but she was showing them the futility of standing against the moon's chosen guardian. Every step she took left a trail of vibrant green moss on the cold stone floors, a sign that the blight could not exist where she walked. Her power was the antidote to the rot that had poisoned her world. As she ascended toward the throne room, she felt the psychic storm of Drogo's rage. It was a jagged, dark thing that threatened to consume him. She knew that he was on the verge of losing himself to the beast forever. If he spilled the blood of his own people in his grief, his soul would be scarred beyond repair. She moved faster, her bare feet barely touching the stone as the lunar fire propelled her forward. She reached the heavy iron doors that led to the main hall, and with a simple touch, the locks melted away. She burst into the room just as Drogo was about to sink his teeth into the general's throat. The radiance coming from her was so bright that it blinded everyone in the hall, forcing even the feral king to pause in his path of destruction. Chapter 18. The confrontation, the throne room fell into a stunned, heavy silence as the light of the sentinel filled the space. Drogo, in his massive wolf form, stood over the cowering general, his fur matted with dust and his eyes burning with a terrifying golden fire. He looked toward Cora, his lips pulled back in a snarl that slowly transformed into a confused whimper. The scent of her, pure, healing, and unmistakably his, hit him like a physical embrace. Cora walked toward him, ignoring the guards who raised their weapons and the council members who scrambled for safety. She saw the monster he had become, and she did not flinch. She saw the blood on his claws and the darkness in his aura, and she offered him the only thing that could bring him back, her hand. "Drogo, stop," she said, her voice carrying a melodic resonance that cut through the psychic static of his rage. She reached out and buried her fingers in the thick fur of his neck, right where his pulse thrummed with a frantic rhythm. The moment their skin touched, a circuit was completed. The silver light from her body flowed into him, calming the jagged edges of his wolf and drawing the man back to the surface. The transformation was painful to watch. His bones shifted and cracked as he returned to his human form. He collapsed against her, his naked chest heaving as he gasped for air, his eyes slowly fading from predatory gold back to their charcoal gray. He clutched her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of shadows. The general, seeing his opportunity to regain control, scrambled to his feet and drew his sword, screaming that Cora was a witch who had bewitched the king. He called for the guards to execute them both for the sake of the alliance. The room held its breath as the general lunged forward, but Cora didn't move. She simply looked at him with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 moons. Before the blade could reach her, a wall of transparent silver fire erupted between them, shattering the general's sword into 100 pieces. The force of the rejection sent the traitor flying across the room, where he landed in a heap at the foot of the throne. Cora stood her ground, her power a shield that no weapon of man could pierce. She turned her gaze to the high priestess and the council, her voice now cold and commanding. She revealed the general's treachery, speaking of the alliance with the shadow creatures and the intentional spread of the blight. She didn't need proof. Her magic acted as a truth seeker, forcing the general to confess his sins under the weight of her lunar light. The court was in an uproar as the truth was laid bare. But even as the traitor was dragged away to the dungeons he had built, Cora felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest. The bond with Drogo was still under attack by the Blood Oath, and the moon was rising higher in the sky. They had won the Battle of the Palace, but the war for their lives was only just beginning. Chapter 19. The Blight's Core. The victory in the throne room was short-lived as a deafening explosion rocked the palace foundations. A messenger, bloodied and breathless, burst into the hall with news that changed everything. The Shadowclaw Pack had not waited for the wedding. They had used the distraction of the king's rampage to launch a full-scale assault on the northern borders. But they weren't just using warriors. They were accompanied by a massive wave of the Blight, a physical wall of oily darkness that was consuming the forest at an impossible speed. The palace was being surrounded by shadow creatures that were neither wolf nor man, but husks of shifters possessed by the rot. The general's betrayal had opened the gates wide, and the enemy was already at the perimeter. Drogo, now dressed in a simple tunic but still bearing the scars of his shift, stood by the window overlooking the valley. He could see the black clouds rolling in, blotting out the stars. He looked at Cora, the weight of his crown returning with a crushing force. He knew he was too weak to lead a defense. The Blood Oath was already beginning to drain his strength again, the black lines on his neck throbbing with every heartbeat. He told the council that they had to evacuate, but Cora stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the center of the dark cloud. She could feel it, the core of the blight. It wasn't just a magical phenomenon. It was a living heart of shadow that was being fed by the general's rituals. She explained that as long as the core existed, no wall or sword could stop the darkness. The only way to save the pack was to strike at the heart of the shadow with the combined power of the Alpha and the Sentinel. The council protested, arguing that the king was in no condition to fight, and that Korra was too valuable to risk in battle. But Drogo silenced them with a single look. He knew that his destiny was tied to hers, and if they were to fall, they would fall together. He took her hand, the contact providing a temporary relief from the pain of the oath. They had to reach the center of the Silverwood before the shadow creatures breached the palace walls, or the north would become a graveyard by morning. As they made their way toward the courtyard, the air became thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. The shadow creatures were clawing at the gates, their eyeless faces pressed against the iron bars. Korra raised her hands, a dome of silver light expanding to protect the retreating pack members. She could feel the strain of the magic, her energy being pulled in a dozen directions at once. Drogo stayed by her side, his presence a stabilizing force that kept her anchored to the earth. They were the last line of defense for a people who had only recently seen them as a scandal. As they stepped out into the night to face the darkness, the first snow of winter began to fall, turning black as it touched the blighted ground. Chapter 20. The Blood Oath's Toll. The morning of the summer solstice arrived not with a golden sunrise, but with a sky the color of a bruised plum. This was the day Drogo was supposed to marry Octavia, the day the Blood Oath was designed to be sealed forever. Instead, the palace was a fortress under siege, and the king was a ghost of his former self. The magical contract was now exacting its final price for his refusal to follow the general's plan. Drogo stood at the altar in the royal chapel, not because he wanted to marry, but because the oath was physically dragging him there. The magic was a tether that refused to be ignored, forcing him into the ritual space as the deadline approached. Every step he took was a battle against his own muscles, his breath coming in shallow, painful wheezes. Octavia stood across from him, dressed in a wedding gown made of silver silk that shimmered like cold moonlight. She didn't look like a grieving bride. She looked like a conqueror. She knew that the oath was her last chance to claim the power she craved. If she could force Drogo to say the vows, the contract would be sealed, and Korra's claim would be severed by the ancient laws of the pack. She looked at the king's deteriorating state with a cold, clinical detachment. She didn't care if he died shortly after the wedding, as long as she became the legal queen and the steward of the Sentinel's magic. The High Priestess began the ceremony, her voice a monotonous drone that ignored the sounds of battle raging outside the chapel doors. Korra was kept at the back of the chapel by a circle of priestesses, her hands bound by enchanted silk that hummed with suppressive magic. She watched in agony as Drogo struggled to stay upright, his eyes constantly searching for hers. The black lines of the oath had reached his jawline, a web of poison that was slowly suffocating him. She tried to call out to him, to tell him she was there, but the air in the chapel was heavy with the weight of the contract, stifling any sound. She realized that the oath wasn't just a legal document, it was a parasitic entity that fed on the life force of the king to maintain the borders of the kingdom. It was a cycle of sacrifice that had to be broken if the North were to truly be free. As the priestess reached the final portion of the vows, the black lines on Drogo's neck began to pulse with a dark, oily light. He swayed on his feet, his hand clutching the edge of the altar for support. The priestess asked the final question. Would he take Octavia as his queen and bind his blood to hers for the survival of the land? Drogo turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Korra's. The room seemed to grow cold as the power of the oath reached its peak, a physical pressure that forced everyone in the chapel to their knees. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of the vows, a single drop of black blood fell from his lip onto the white marble floor. The clock struck midday, and the toll of the blood oath began to resonate through the mountain like a funeral bell. Chapter 21. The Alpha Queen's Roar. The silence in the chapel was heavy, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to draw the very life from Drogo's lungs. He stood at the precipice of total collapse, the black lines of the blood oath constricting his throat like a hangman's noose. Octavia reached out to take his hand, her fingers cold and possessive, ready to seal the contract that would erase Cora from his existence forever. But before their skin could touch, a sudden, violent surge of lunar energy exploded from the back of the room. The enchanted silk bonds that had held Cora's wrists didn't just snap, they disintegrated into silver embers. She stepped forward, the radiance pouring from her skin so intense that the priestesses were thrown backward by the sheer force of her arrival. Every step she took toward the altar cracked the marble beneath her feet, the silver crescent on her neck burning with the brightness of a midday sun. Cora's voice was no longer that of a quiet Omega. It was a resonant, multi-layered command that shook the very foundations of the Obsidian Palace. She moved through the aisle like a storm made of moonlight, her eyes glowing with an ancient authority that demanded total submission from every wolf in the room. Octavia shrieked in outrage, ordering the guards to seize the intruder, but the men found themselves physically unable to move, their bodies locked by a power that bypassed their physical strength. Cora reached the altar, standing between the dying king and the woman who would have stolen his soul for her own ambition. She looked at the high priestess, whose face was pale with a mixture of terror and awe. The ceremony was no longer a wedding. It was a confrontation between a corrupt law and a celestial truth. The black lines on Drogo's neck began to sizzle and smoke as they came into contact with the aura of Cora's light. The blood oath shrieked, a high-pitched psychic wail that only those with shifter blood could truly hear. Cora turned her gaze toward the crowd of nobles, council members, and traitors who had stood by while their king was drained of his life. She didn't offer a plea or a request for mercy. Instead, she drew in a deep breath, her chest expanding with the weight of the forest and the power of the moon. She let out a roar that mirrored Drogo's command from the night of the gala, but it was amplified by the Sentinel's magic. "Everyone out! Now!" The command was absolute. It wasn't just a vocalization. It was a wave of kinetic energy that physically swept everyone but Drogo from the chapel. The heavy iron doors slammed shut with a thunderous boom, leaving the Alpha King and the Lunar Sentinel alone in the sacred space. The silence that followed was even more profound than the one before, but it was no longer heavy with the scent of death. It was the silence of a new beginning, a space cleared for a miracle. Drogo collapsed into her arms, his body trembling as the blood oath fought one last desperate battle to maintain its hold on his heart. He looked up at her, his vision blurring as the poison reached his eyes, and whispered that he was sorry he couldn't protect her from the darkness. Cora held him close, her silver light wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. She knew that the oath was still there, woven into his very heart, and that the only way to save him was to do something that defied every law of nature. She would have to kill the man she loved to save the king he was meant to be. Chapter 22. Breaking the Final Bond. The Chapel of the North was a tomb of silver light as Cora held the fading Alpha King in her arms. The blood oath was a parasitic curse, and as long as Drogo's heart beat, the contract remained active, draining him until there would be nothing left but a husk of charcoal and bone. She could feel the black veins pulsing against her palms, the oily darkness of the oath fighting her lunar fire with a stubborn, ancient malice. There was only one way to break a blood contract of this magnitude. The blood must cease to flow entirely. The realization was a cold, jagged stone in her chest. To reset his lineage and purge the general's curse, she would have to stop his heart, effectively ending the Wolfris line for a brief, terrifying moment before bringing him back through the Sentinel's power. Drogo seemed to understand her intent through the bond, his mind brushing against hers with a clarity that surpassed words. He reached up, his hand trembling as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. His eyes were clear, the charcoal gray filled with a profound trust that made Cora's heart break. He whispered for her to do it, to take his life so that he could be reborn as hers and hers alone, free from the chains of his ancestors. He was a king who had lived for his people, But in his final moments, he was simply a man who wanted only to belong to his mate. Korra closed her eyes, tears tracking silver lines down her cheeks as she prepared to commit the ultimate act of love and sacrifice. She placed her right hand over his heart and her left over the silver crescent on her neck, forming a circuit of life and light. She began to chant in the old tongue, a language that vibrated in the marrow of the earth and the roots of the mountains. The air in the chapel began to spin in a localized vortex, the silver light turning into a blinding white that obscured the walls. Korra pushed her magic deep into his chest, not as a healer this time, but as a silent, heavy command for his body to rest. She felt the steady, frantic thrum of his heart beneath her palm, a rhythm she had memorized during their few nights together. Slowly, the beats grew further apart, the life force receding like a retreating tide. Each second felt like a century of agony as she watched the light fade from his eyes. 1, 2, 3. And then, there was nothing. The silence was absolute, a void that seemed to consume the entire palace. The black lines on his skin instantly evaporated, the blood oath shattering like glass because it no longer had a living host to cling to. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the Alpha King was dead, and the world seemed to lose its color. Korra didn't hesitate. She threw her head back and let out a scream of pure, unfiltered power, calling upon the moon to return what had been taken. She channeled the entire life force of the Silverwood through her body, acting as a lightning rod for the world's vitality. She slammed her palm against his chest, a shockwave of silver fire erupting from the contact point. Drogo's body arched off the floor, his lungs suddenly expanding with a violent, gasping breath that sounded like a thunderclap. His heart kicked back into life, but it was no longer burdened by the weight of dead kings and stolen contracts. It beat with the raw, untainted power of a sovereign who had been reborn in the light of his sentinel. He grabbed Korra's shoulders, his strength returning with a ferocity that made her gasp. They were both gasping for air, their souls finally fused into a single, unbreakable unit. But as the warmth returned to his skin, the sounds of war outside the chapel doors grew louder. The oath was broken, but the enemies who had created it were still at the gates, and they were bringing the full force of the Blight with them. Chapter 23. The Battle for the North. The moment Drogo opened his eyes, the heavy doors of the chapel were blown inward by a surge of oily black shadow. The Shadow Claw pack had finally breached the inner sanctum, led by the corrupted husk of the general who had fully surrendered to the Blight in his desperation for power. But they were no longer facing a dying king and a frightened Omega. Drogo stood up, his body radiating a new, terrifying level of alpha energy that made the air around him shimmer with heat. He didn't need a sword, his very presence was a weapon that pushed back the darkness. Beside him, Korra stood with her hands glowing like twin stars, her sentinel mark shining through the tattered fabric of her gown. They didn't speak. They moved as a single entity, a perfect balance of destruction and restoration. They stepped out into the main hall, where the battle was at its most desperate and bloody. The Northern Guards were being pushed back by a tide of shadow shifters, but the momentum shifted the instant the king appeared. Drogo let out a roar that was no longer a command of forced obedience, but a battle cry that ignited the spirits of his men. He shifted mid-stride, his charcoal gray wolf now larger and more powerful than ever before, his fur tipped with the silver light of the sentinel. He tore through the ranks of the Shadowclaw warriors like a scythe through wheat, his every strike purging the darkness from the air. Korra followed in his wake, her palms turned outward as she sent waves of lunar fire across the battlefield, turning the blighted husks back into ash. The general confronted them in the center of the courtyard, his body twisted into a monstrous shape by the rot he had courted. He was a nightmare of obsidian bone and shadow, his voice a chorus of 1,000 dying screams. He lunged at Korra, sensing that she was the source of the light that was killing his army. But Drogo was there, his massive jaws locking onto the general's throat as he pinned the traitor to the ground with a force that cracked the earth. Cora didn't turn away from the sight. She placed her hands on the general's chest, not to heal him, but to return the stolen energy he had used to fuel the blight. The light poured into the traitor, and for a moment his human eyes returned, filled with a sudden, horrific realization of what he had done before he disintegrated into a pile of gray dust. With the general gone, the core of the blight began to collapse, losing the anchor that held it to the physical world. Cora raised her arms to the sky, connecting with the full moon that was now visible through the dissipating clouds. She released a final, massive pulse of healing energy that swept across the entire territory like a cleansing wind. The shadow creatures vanished like mist in the sun, and the blackened trees of the Silverwood began to sprout new green shoots in the middle of the winter snow. The war was over in a matter of minutes, the darkness purged by the union of the two most powerful bloodlines in history. Drogo shifted back to human form and walked to Cora's side, the two of them looking out over a kingdom that was finally, truly safe from the rot that had nearly consumed it. Chapter 24. The Lunar Queen's Reign. The days following the Great Purge were filled with the labor of rebuilding, but for the first time in generations, the people of the Northern Pack worked with hope rather than fear. The political landscape of the territories had been fundamentally altered. Lady Octavia, stripped of her titles and her family's stolen wealth, was brought before the new High Council to face judgment. She was not executed, for Cora believed that death was too easy a sentence for the woman who had sought to steal a soul for a crown. Instead, she was exiled to the frozen wastes of the far north, her magic bound so that she would live out her days as a common human, far from the throne she had coveted. The High Priestess and the corrupt elders were removed from power, replaced by those who had stood with the king. The coronation of the Lunar Queen was an event that the Pack would talk about for centuries to come. It took place not in the cold stone throne room, but in the heart of the Silverwood, under the boughs of the ancient oak that Cora had first healed. Thousands of shifters gathered in the clearing, their scents blending into a symphony of peace and unity. Drogo stood at the center, his crown of obsidian replaced by a simple circlet of silver birch and moonstone. When Cora walked toward him, dressed in a gown woven from the light of the stars, the forest itself seemed to bow in her presence. He didn't just crown her as his consort. He knelt before her in front of his entire pack, acknowledging her as his equal and the true savior of their land. As the crown was placed upon her head, the silver crescent on Cora's neck flared with a soft, permanent glow that reflected the light of the moon. The bond between them was no longer a source of pain or a biological trap to be feared. It was a bridge of light that connected their spirits, a source of infinite strength that they would draw upon for the rest of their lives. Drogo took her hand and led her to the twin thrones carved from living wood, their fingers interlaced. He looked out at his people, his voice clear and filled with a warmth that had been missing for so long. He spoke of a new era where rank was not a cage and where the light of the moon would guide them through the darkest winters. That night, they stood together on the balcony of the Obsidian Palace, looking out at the revitalized forest that shimmered in the moonlight. The heat that had started it all had settled into a steady, loving flame that warmed their souls and solidified their future. Cora leaned her head against Drogo's shoulder, her hand resting over the spot where she had once stopped his heart to save his life. They were no longer the invisible Omega and the ruthless King of the Legends. They were the Alpha and the Sentinel, the balance that the world had been waiting for. As the moon reached its zenith, Drogo leaned down and whispered her name, a sound of pure, fated devotion. The story that had begun with a roar of possessive command ended with a whisper of eternal love.